Hey everyone, this is your host. That's kind of between the coast. It's Andrew Rochford, host of the Rochford Files. As y'all know, please go down into the link tree in the description and support the channel on other platforms. As always, don't forget to like and share the stream and comments as well. And for this segment, it's going to touch on some recent things that have happened at the Hills Rising. And I know the main thing that happened was Katie Halper getting fired by the Hill over the segment that was supposed to air uh, over when it came to Rashida Tlaib and speaking in favor of Palestine. But before we get to that point, I think this is like a precursor event. So Nick Cruz of Revolutionary Blackout Network, last week, he went on the show thanks to Brianna Joy Gray and was able to speak about the situation in Venezuela and the sanctions that the United States is putting on it. And I'm going to play a bit of that because I think that's a precursor to why it's possible that Katie Halper is in the position where she got fired from the Hill this week. So I think it's a good point to start there first. So I'm going to jump ahead to the video where Robbie Sauvé is close to joining in and challenging his viewpoints. Something that I remember that Sauger never did when he was the conservative on the Hill alongside Crystal Ball. So I thought that was kind of different because you usually don't see the guests push back from the other side of the spectrum. Very rarely, that is.
Germany, and the United States imposing their imperial conquest ambitions on the global south. They think they have the right to ruin the lives of Venezuelans, for example, and other countries because they reject their capitalist imperialist political agenda. The Venezuelan people 100% knows what's going on. That's why Nicolas Maduro is stronger than ever. And this is another example of U.S. sanctions failing. They know the United States government is trying to take them down to install far right-wing fascist that is mostly white, that is mostly bourgeoisie, that has been waging an active class war against Venezuela. When you look at Nicolas Maduro and the socialist revolution that started 20 years ago, that is mostly supported by Black, indigenous, and poor people. And you have the white bourgeoisie who in charge of the media, who run all the companies. They have been waging a class war backed by the United States, backed and supported by the United States. So it's the height of irony. The Democrats and Pierre, they complain about January 6th. If you look at the coups they sponsor in these countries that she listed, that January 6th is child play compared to what we do to Venezuela. We back Bolsonaro, who used to send death squads into Venezuela to assassinate and kill Maduro supporters. You had the hard far-right fascists in Venezuela that was setting left-wing supporters of Nicolas Maduro on fire in the streets. These are the people that we support. So the idea that you're going to blame an economic model instead of our actions is ridiculous on face value.
Okay, look, I also oppose many of the policies you just mentioned, the support for regime change. I would get rid of all these sanctions too. But let's not gloss over the long history of corruption and political persecution by left-wing regimes in all of these countries as well, under policies that have totally immiserated Cuba and Venezuela. It's on and on and on. I think it's laughable to say it's all the U.S.'s fault.
So Cuba has a higher life expectancy than the United States, a higher literacy rate, a much better healthcare system, despite the fact that the United States stole billions of dollars from them. So I'm asking you, Robbie, what's the excuse for the United States? Of course, there are always missteps that governments make, but the United States is the richest empire that we ever seen. 1 out of 5 children live in poverty in this country. If you look at Skid Row, I am asking you, what is the excuse for the United States? You have Venezuela, you have Cuba, you have all these countries that has been the victim of U.S. economic war that you guys call sanctions. Sanctions is seized warfare. You guys locked out Venezuela from the international market. You blame their economic system. We have the record amount of income inequality in this country that is higher than the era of serfdom. So, Robbie, what's the excuse for capitalists? Who's sanctioning us?
I don't think Skid Row, I mean, the collapse of American cities under progressive liberal democratic regimes is not really an indictment of Trump policies or capitalist policies. I mean, we get to if it's so great in Cuba, why are they fleeing here? Why are they crossing shark-infested waters?
Well, Robbie, the point that Nick is making is that, look, if you really think it's the economic systems in Cuba or Venezuela that are so destructive, why not lift sanctions, let them sink or fall on their own merit, and then we could have a legitimate conversation about whether communism fails. But what so many people on the left are frustrated with is that there has never been a communist or socialist government that has been allowed to freely test the model without the economic war, I love how you put it there, Nick, against them that basically rigs the game from the start.
There's also never been a communist.
So that right there was an example of a brief Anna Joy Gray bringing on a guest and Nick Cruz and expanding the Hill's acceptable window of discourse. And the reason why I bring that up is because I think it's an important precursor here, because now with Katie Halper, maybe if that moment didn't happen, maybe the whole her segment gets to go through the way without like the type of fear from the executives who run this network of having audience start to overly applaud a revolutionary voice like Nick Cruz instead of the typical professional managerial class voices. They'll accept someone who's slightly outside of the establishment thinking when it comes to that. But I think that was a moment where they're starting to change their mind on the whole letting more voices further outside of their acceptable range break in. And that is absolutely a complete indictment on the Hill, by the way. Not by voices like Nick, who crushed that performance last week, as it's time to bring up a little clip of Katie Halper, who did a short stream last night, explaining what happened.
Okay, I'm down. You got limits, man. You got limits, man. Okay, I'm down.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Katie Halper Show. I'm your host, Katie Halper, as you know. And as you all know, I do host, obviously, the Katie Halper Show. I also host Useful Idiots, another podcast and YouTube show. And I recently had started doing some guest co-hosting at Rising, which is a YouTube show hosted by The Hill. I even pitched a show to The Hill, which was a lefty version of The View, which we shot a pilot for last Friday. And for the last 3 years, I've appeared on The Hill's Rising as a guest once a week to do a weekly segment on media and politics. And I've always really enjoyed working with The Hill. And I felt like I was given the freedom to talk about whatever I wanted to talk about. And I really did see it as a place free of the censorship and the kind of like party line enforcement that defines other corporate media. So, as I said, I'd been doing some guest hosting at the Hill, and I really enjoyed it. And I hosted this Monday and had already lined up some more hosting events for the near future. And Rising hosts do these things called radars, which are basically monologues delivered straight to the camera. So I wanted to deliver a monologue about Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib being criticized by some over comments she made about people who are progressive except on Palestine. And she was slammed for describing Israel as an apartheid state. So my monologue basically defended Tlaib and kind of broke down why Israel is, in fact, an apartheid state. So I wrote my monologue and I delivered it, and the Hill filmed it, but then they did not air it. And when I pushed back against their not airing it, I was fired, not just as a host, but also as a weekly contributor, which is something I'd been doing again for 3 years. So I do want to be clear that the producers I worked with were nothing but supportive. They were great, and they really wanted their higher ups, their bosses, the executives to do the right thing. But sadly, they wouldn't. And this is obviously really sad and frustrating and disappointing and infuriating. And there's nothing I can do about their decision to not run the monologue. And there's nothing I can do about their decision to stop working with me or to fire me. But what I can do, and what I did do, was film and release the video that they wouldn't air. So I reached out to an actually progressive, actually independent, actually uncensored media.
So that right there is just an example of, I think, what potentially got exposed is the Hill over these past few months is once you touch on certain topics and go outside of a comfort zone of discourse that they're willing to allow, that's when they start to change on you and start to uh, either make it to where you no longer want to work with them or they fire you. And I know that with Kim Iverson, it was when they did the interview with Anthony Fauci, and she got left out from it. And that was by design because she was one that was putting in discourse a lot that was outside of the corporate media, especially when it came to COVID. So we know at that point, that's when Kim no longer wanted anything to do with working on the Hill. And as we can tell, even though Katie Halper is a member of the professional managerial class and is still considered to be milquetoast in certain aspects by people to her left, Israel and Palestine is one of those touchy topics that will get the Hill to clamp in on it and to make sure that doesn't get through. So that once again is just another in the few moments where the Hill has been exposed for not being as truly anti-establishment as they proclaim themselves to be. And that's been showing for quite a while, especially after Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty both left. And it's been even more apparent after that once they started to step in and restrict the type of stuff that many of those people who we don't even consider to be that good for the most part to be outside of their comfort zone. And now we'll play a bit of that segment that Katie didn't get to have air on the Hill on Breakthrough News. So we'll give a little teaser of that.
The following monologue is something that I wrote, delivered, and recorded at the Hill. It was then censored, and I was then canceled and fired. Representative Rashida Tlaib has been condemned by some over comments she made about Israel. Here's CNN's Jake Tapper reporting on what the Michigan Democrat said and the response it prompted.
Democratic Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib of Michigan facing criticism today from what several of her Jewish colleagues have deemed anti-Semitic comments. Here's what Tlaib, the first Palestinian-American woman to serve in Congress, said at a virtual event yesterday.
I want you all to know that among progressives, it has become clear that you cannot claim to hold progressive values, yet back Israel's apartheid government. And we will continue to push back and not accept this idea that you are progressive except for Palestine any longer.
So that right there is quite the call out to Jamal Bowman, John Fetterman, Richie Torres, even though no one ever really considered him progressive outside of his campaign run. But that was a good call out, even though ultimately it's not going to lead to anything substantive, but it was at least a necessary statement. Let's jump ahead a bit to where Katie continues speaking a bit more.
Is outrageous. It's outrageous that Rashida Tlaib is getting attacked. Tlaib is merely stating that Israel is an apartheid state and that people who claim to have progressive values cannot support an apartheid state. No matter how loose a definition of progressive we use, it certainly excludes supporting a racist apartheid system. What's outrageous is attacking Tlaib for pointing out that progressive except for Palestine is an intrinsically contradictory position. What's also outrageous is that the Anti-Defamation League's Jonathan Greenblatt would claim that Israel is not an apartheid government. What's outrageous is that Jake Tapper would accept Greenblatt's judgment as the truth and not propaganda that needed to be pushed back against. I understand that Greenblatt and perhaps Tapper feel like Israel is not an apartheid state, but unfortunately for them, apartheid isn't about your feelings. It's about facts. In 1973, the
So that doesn't sound, to us at least, like it's this segment that should be worthy of censorship, because that really isn't. We've seen plenty of people on the left go much harder, much more aggressively when it comes to the issues of Israel and Palestine. And that right there is an example about how the Hill, there's other people, not just what I think will lead to Nick Cruz not ever getting another, or the rest of the RBN members ever getting another invite, because I think that's the unfortunate Pandora's box of a great moment like that has opened. And now that they're really going to rein it in further and make sure that only the safe professional managerial class voices get in. Because that's what they really want these days. That's the signs that they're showing. I mean, I saw that apparently Jackson Hinkle got his appearance on the Hill canceled, I believe, earlier this week. He was supposed to discuss the Nordic pipeline, and it went down in similar fashion. And we know that Jackson, in terms of foreign policy, he really pushes them out of their comfort zone, especially given how their host, by and large, stay within the very acceptable establishment discourse when it comes to the foreign policy. So someone like Jackson is considered very extreme on that. So that's apparently someone else. Then another person who was a pretty good co-host on the Hill, who hasn't been on for a while, Olayemi Olurin, and I think this exposes how do you think they want these type of discussions to happen on the Hill? She did some pretty good monologues taking down the police state, but I think there's a point where they're now going to make sure a voice like her, who had been on the show in the past, going in on the police state, Eric Adams, among other things, they don't. I think they're also, and she may be another person who you won't see on there again, and it's because they're not going to allow this type of discussion to take place. And even though in this debate, Cenk Uygur showed his ass a lot in it, and a Kasparian too, the important part is Olayemi had the platform to go on to advocate for bail reform that is currently trying to make its way through Illinois. And that's another person who I can see being negatively affected, who probably already has, by the Hill making the decision to clamp down. So that is going to lead to the next person, Brianna Joy Gray, who, if there's any criticism to be made of her, it's the fact that she tries to straddle the fence, so to speak, and try to please her professional managerial class friends, and at the same time try to keep things keep the bridge open to people to the left of her, like Revolutionary Blackout Network. And that's going to be the next domino to fall, because she'll either be in a position where she tries to go to bat for RBN member again, and that could lead to potentially the Hill taking some type of action again, or she'll mainly just get along to go. And that's where the direction of the Hill is going. They're now afraid. They don't want those moments of Ole, Yemi, or Nick breaking through, or even Sabby Sabs. I think now they're going to make sure that those moments don't happen. And they're only going to, and for the people on the left now, it's going to be full-on professional managerial class types who won't make them uncomfortable. That's the direction the Hill's now going. And it took a couple big moments of people who you don't expect to get featured on the show to expose how they're fearful of having that become a regular thing, even though that would be the thing that would make the Hill better. But instead, they want more people who have the charisma of a dead puppet sock like Ryan Grimm to be the main voices of the Hill, rather than fiery, passionate people like Nick Cruz or Ole Yemi. And the Hill is making their bed, and they're now burying themselves in it over their decision to censor and get cold feet when they had a chance to make their rising show get a bit better.